building, which, as everyone knows, has a ton of history. Welcome, everyone. We will get started right at 9 o'clock. Oh, it's 9 o'clock. So welcome, everyone. We are going to get started. And I'm so glad everyone could join us for our first virtual Lumsden and McCormick Annual Exempt Conference. My name is Maria Gambacorta, and I will serve as the host for today's webinars. Before we get to introductions, I want to run through a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded, and once available, we will share a link with all of you. It will be on the Lumsden and McCormick website. Chat and Q&A are enabled, so if you would please type any comments in the chat, and as the host, I will respond to you. Any questions, please add them in the Q&A section. We will answer questions as best we can throughout, throughout the session. As many of you know, we are offering CPE credit for this webinar, 1 hour of CPE credit. All polling and survey questions need to be answered for us to be able to issue that CPE. We will have 4 polling questions. You'll be prompted for each, and the results will be shared. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey, which will launch automatically. If you would please complete that. There are only 11 questions. 6 of them are multiple choice, so it's very easy and quick. For those requiring CPE credits, a certificate will be emailed to everyone by December 21st. And if permitted by the presenters, we will share the slide decks along with the recordings, as I said earlier. So I am going to pass this over to our moderator, Jill Johnson. Jill is an audit partner at Lumsden and McCormick, specializing in healthcare institutions and human service organizations. Jill is a certified information technology professional, which is a designation issued by the American Institute of CPAs. So Jill, I'm passing it on to you.
Great, thanks Maria. Good morning and welcome to our annual Exempt Conference. We're happy to be able to host this virtual event this year. It's my pleasure to introduce Holly Hubert. Holly is a retired FBI agent, having been with the Bureau for over 25 years, including serving as the Assistant Special Agent in charge of Buffalo's cyber program. Today, Holly is the CEO of Global Security IQ, a cybersecurity consulting solution firm with offices located in Buffalo and Tampa, Florida. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here for the second time. I hope that that everybody's doing well out there, and I'm happy to report this is cybersecurity, and it's not PPP 101 and how to get a loan forgiven. I don't know if you're relieved about that, or you're mad about that, or happy about that, because I know it's been nonstop PPP talk. Anyway, just a few things about what we're going to do here today. I hope that if we're successful at the end of the presentation, that you'll have an understanding of what threats are facing you in the cyber realm, some mitigation strategies in terms of recognizing phishing emails and other scams, and what your IT people can do about to mitigate and lower risk in some of these threats, and what can you as executive leaders. I understand in the audience we have a lot of CFOs. That is my favorite audience to speak to. Literally, the CFOs really hold a great deal of responsibility in cyber health, because all the cyber individuals or all the IT people in any organization, they know they need things. And they ask and they worry about these threats, and they worry about being penetrated and having a data breach. But really it comes down to, what do you do in the organization proactively? And it takes some dedicated resources and some financial commitment to really do the proper offensive hardening and risk recognition in any organization. So welcome. And I wanted to just really hit this head on. I get asked this every single presentation I ever do. The Silence of the Lambs thing comes up for the last 28 years. and I get asked, is there a profile for a cyber criminal? Absolutely everywhere I go. And the answer to that is there's not. This is a problem that really knows no socioeconomic boundaries. If you're sometimes smaller businesses, and as we all know, 99% of businesses in America are small businesses. And I think some leadership in small businesses think, oh, they're only after the big guys, they're only after the big organizations. And that's really not true. There's no profile for a victim. Everyone's at risk. And there's really no profile in terms of what an attacker looks like. But what we can talk about are motivations, like what motivates individuals to commit cyber crimes. The number one reason why people do it is obviously financial. They want to steal money, they want to steal secrets, and they want to gain economic advantage. National security motivations, you're going to hear a lot about China and Russia today, and essentially government networks are at risks, and all networks really in America, especially if you manufacture and you make something proprietary, you're at risk. Insider is another motivation. Well, I have a slide that we just talk about the insider threat, which is really interesting because I track these motivations over time. In the FBI, I've been very lucky and blessed to be in on the ground floor in cyber crime when it was a thing. When I first got into the Bureau, there wasn't a thing called computer crime. We didn't see breaches and attacks, and it really wasn't something that the FBI addressed really until the 90s. And so I was lucky to be on the ground floor. So I've been looking at the insider type of threat right from ground zero, and it's crept up over the years. And now we see almost 28% of cyber crime really comes from an insider. And I talk a lot about that in a minute. And then hacktivism. Those are those individuals that normally we see web-based defacements and other breaches because individuals simply don't agree with the mission of the organization. So who are the threat actors? Well, we're going to talk a lot about the two biggies today. There's China, there's Russia, there's the insider threat that I touched on, and there's everyone else. So first, let's talk about China. This is a big deal. It's a big threat. Recently, we've heard more about China than we've ever heard in the news and certainly in the political realm. And this is a very unusual statement that I want to talk about. This picture right here is Director Chris Wray. He's the director of the FBI. He came on board in late 1999. And he actually 2018, 2018. And he basically, this is a really big deal for an FBI director to be so blunt and pointed about a threat from another country. And so this is a very important quote here. The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. That is a really big deal for an FBI director to actually name a country that's the biggest threat. Over half of the FBI's 5,000 counterintelligence investigation are all attributed to China. It is more likely than not that China has stolen your personal information. If you think of the Equifax breach a couple of years ago, half of Americans had their information breached or spilled. Over half. And then rolling back the clock a few years earlier, there was the Anthem breach that hit some of the Anthem, Blue Cross and Blue Shield brands. And you may have gotten a letter from them about your identity being stolen. And then the OPM hack. That is a very amazing, pointed counterintelligence hack promulgated by the Chinese government. And when I talk about the China threat, I'm not talking about hardworking Chinese Americans. I'm talking about the government of China and government-sponsored crime. So when I talk about the OPM hack in 2014, over 25 million data records were stolen, and they were actually any individual that carried a security clearance when you get a security clearance, you have to fill out this unbelievable amount of paperwork, literally a 100-page document, and it's everything and your whole extended family, and there's so much expansive information in there. It's really quite unbelievable. And from 1985 to 2014, every person that had a top secret clearance had their information breached by China. And that I'm talking about the military services, the FBI, all government agencies, if you had a top secret security clearance. So, and when you take that and add in Anthem and add in Equifax, it's more likely that your information was in fact breached or is maintained by China. It's very important that you know that today. The second major threat is Russia. It's the threat. You know, we had the threat to the election. It was a persistent concern. There was a threat to the previous election. And then we have to talk about the NotPetya ransomware attack in 2017. There were billions of dollars in losses, over $400 million to FedEx alone. Well, I'll move my little, so you can see here the whole slide. And $670 million to Merck Corporation, all rolled back to China. And again, this is a government-sponsored hacking group promulgating these threats. These are not one-off criminal enterprises. This is organized. It's driven by the government. It's the same situation in China. They have actual organized criminal hackers that hack on behalf of the government of Russia with a mission to steal information. The Olympics, the 2018 Winter Olympics, actually during the opening ceremony, there was a malicious code dropped called the Olympic Destroyer. And that rolled back to Russia. There was a lot of a big investigation, and there was not attribution for a while, but it was in fact later attributed to Russia. And you might not have known it, but if you were sitting in the audience for the opening ceremonies, all of a sudden everybody's cell phones went dead. And there was an assumption by those that were present that, oh, it's just the massive amount of people together in the one venue. But there was actually a massive attack happening on all the servers for the Winter Olympic Games in an effort to embarrass the host country and to embarrass the Olympic Committee. However, they did such a good job with servers and backups and readiness that they were able to roll the alternate servers, and really to the public that was viewing the Olympics on TV, it really wasn't a noticeable event. But Russia really is a global threat. It really is. It's not just a threat against the United States. They're responsible for blackouts in the Ukraine, United States hospitals, schools, governments, all sectors. So when we see China, that's economic espionage. They want secrets, they want trade secrets, they want technology, and they want information. And they amass all this information until they use it later. With China, they're looking for economic advantage, they're looking for disruption, and they're looking to make money. And they're looking to prove a superpower. So actually that NotPetya group actually was indicted last year by the Justice Department after a multi-year investigation. So as I mentioned before, there's China, there's Russia, and there's everyone else. There are other threat countries that really are very, very good at hacking, very sophisticated, very good. The Iranians, very good. North Korea, Turkey, of course, we have terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others. So there's everyone else, Russia, China, and then we have our insider threat. Got to move this around again. Any questions before I go on? There may not be yet.
No questions yet.
How are we doing, Jill? Is this good placement for the little boxes?
Everything looks good on my side.
All right. So let's talk about insider threat for a second. This is an example. This is a very good case that I use in presentations to talk about because we have a presence of DuPont. It's a global organization. And this case was around Kevlar. And so everybody knows that Kevlar is a very hard material. It's the stuff that bulletproof vests are made of, that law enforcement and the military utilize Kevlar is actually in skis, a hard, flexible material. So DuPont actually developed Kevlar. And this individual, Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell, worked on the creation of Kevlar for 24 years. He was a marketing executive and an engineer, and essentially was passed over for promotions and became disgruntled. So he took DuPont sensitive files in thumb drives. He offloaded them to thumb drives, and he took documents, and he actually sold them to the competition. And so, you know, I know I said there's not really a profile, but we do see some commonality for specifically for insider threats. It's usually males that we see do this. The average is 37. I don't know that average really means anything more than it is an average. I think a younger person could do it. An older person could certainly should be suspect. But the most important statistic to note about insider threats is that 86% of those inside threat perpetrators actually take information from areas in which they're directly responsible. And 60% actually take information and IP from areas that they are directly responsible for developing. So, and most of the insider threat is actually discovered by non-employees. So this is a problem for companies. All companies should really have some sort of mechanism in place where the insider threat is talked about, at least among leadership and management. There should be some things that individuals look for to see if there's perhaps an individual that might need extra help, counseling, might have an issue. But usually the insider threat starts with a disgruntled employee or somebody that has some really insurmountable problem on the outside. It could be a gambling addiction. It could be marital problems. It could be financial and over their head. It could be drug addiction. And then they have really a motivation to get money. Or somebody that's upset because they were passed over. It's very, very common. So this is a whole nother kind of threat that I personally call the accidental insider threat. And really that is the well-meaning and usually reliable IT employee or any employee. You have the employee that's dedicated to their company, loyal, does a wonderful job, loves their organization, and really, really wants to do well there. But they do something that maybe they have a short-term lapse in their security presence of mind and take a laptop home. And maybe the laptop has intellectual property on there. And then they stop at a grocery store and don't lock the door. And the laptop gets stolen out of the car. This happens a lot in the healthcare realm. If there's HIPAA data or if there's data that belongs to patients, healthcare data on that laptop, that's actually a breach. It's actually a spill, and it's an obligatory reportable event. So you have to think about, what kind of tools that you give your employees. Are you giving your employees thumb drives? Do you give your employees laptops? Do you have annual training about how to secure and what to do with those laptops? The other type of accidental insider threat is that well-meaning IT person. So now when you think about cybersecurity, really it's a new profession, relatively speaking, right? Jill, how long has accounting been a profession?
Longer than I've been around.
That's a question maybe I'd like to know the answer to. Maybe hundreds of years, as long as there's been numbers. Somebody's been keeping track of numbers. Is that fair? But when you think of IT, it's really relatively new in this scheme of professional environments. Computers really haven't been around that long, right? 30 years maybe. And computers as the instrument to perpetrate a crime is really kind of a new thing. This is a thing that's emerged really in the late 90s. So when you think about that, we've had computers to run our companies, run our organizations, and all of our companies depend on computers to make it run. So you have IT people either on staff or you outsource it. There are 24 business IT vendors right here in Buffalo. Perhaps you have them and you think about business IT. They're paid to make your business run. And if you think about all the components that you might have servers, you have laptops, you have iPads, you have Macs, you have workstations, you have cell phones now, you have firewalls, you have routers, you have switches, and you have all this networking equipment, and then you have all these applications, right? So there's Windows Server, you have all the Microsoft suite of the business tools that you use, you have your accounting tools, you have all your banking online, and you have multiple applications, right? If you're in manufacturing, you're doing CAD, you're doing CAD CAM. If you're a not-for-profit, you have some sort of mechanism where you track all your donations and the people that you want to seek donations from. If you think about all the software and all the hardware and how it all fits together, every single one of those things I mentioned has a cybersecurity component. But the mission of these things is to make your business run. So you think you have your IT person, and I think that poor person, whoever that is, usually in a small to medium company, there's one, maybe two people. Believe me, that's the most stressed human on the face of the earth. It's a terrible job. and IT people always go, every time I talk about that, they go, yeah, it is. Tell my boss I'm so stressed, because they're responsible to keep all of this stuff going and to make the business run. But when the boss, when there's no toner in the printer, they got to run down and do that too. So think of all that responsibility. Now enter cybersecurity and cyber crime. Every single one of those things has a cybersecurity component to it. So how does that person who is responsible for all of this stuff and operating with that tremendous threat, how are they going to develop a whole nother set of expertise in terms of the cybersecurity that should be executed and evaluated on every single one of those components? It's impossible. Cybersecurity is its own profession. And I tell everybody that I talk to, if you have a knee problem, you need to go to a knee surgeon. You're not going to have a brain surgeon operate on your knee, and you sure as heck don't want a knee surgeon operating on your brain. It's both doctors, both surgeons, both medical schools, both know how to operate, but it's two different areas of expertise. So you have to really think about that as an organization. Having a cybersecurity professional do a professional vulnerability assessment. And I'll talk about what that really means in a second. So please do think about that. The Verizon data breach. Verizon for the last 10 or 15 years has put together a research document of breaches. And you think they do the cell phones, but really Verizon is one of the major backbones of the internet. So they have access to the data. So I put a lot of faith, and I read this diligently every year. And I think about what are the takeaways and how are they important to organizations, and how are they important to teach. But 70% of breaches were caused by outsiders. Now I talked about who those outsiders might be, but 30% were caused by insiders. And as I said, when they first started doing all this data, it was like 12%. And it steadily crept up over the year. Last year it was 28. The year before that, 25 was the insider threat. So you really have to think about that. Organized criminal group was behind 55% of breaches were attributed to an organized criminal group. And 86% of breaches were financially motivated. So that's a very, very high number. That really is only 14% were motivated, by other motivations. Remember, I mentioned national security, hacktivism. So 43% of breaches were attacks on a web app, and that's double from last year, and that's why it's important. So if you have external facing information, it is important to secure that information. A lot of organizations have portals. You can sign into a portal. That's its own world of cybersecurity right there. So the fact that that attack vector has doubled in a year means we need to pay attention to it. Most malicious code is still delivered by email, and we're going to talk about email in a second here. But a little bit about the business impacts of a breach. Obviously, you have the loss of your reputation and your customers become upset with you, but there are requirements to report. So, and I think the regulatory agencies have become very good at collecting this information. It used to be that when an organization was breached, their instinct was to really not want to let the information get out for fear of, again, the loss of reputation and consumer confidence. But there are now requirements to report. If you deal with credit cards in your company, if you take credit, you have a whole set, the payment card industry has a whole set of IT, cybersecurity regulations, and also requirements to report breaches. If you have healthcare information, I touched on it before, the HIPAA, people think about HIPAA and they think, oh, I have this bad knee, and nobody can know that Holly has a bad knee. And so, because that's my private healthcare information. And that's what they think that the HIPAA privacy rule is. But there's really two parts to it. There's a HIPAA IT security rule that's part of the bigger privacy rule. So the HIPAA IT security rule says that an organization needs to do X number of offensive hardening techniques or best practices to prevent the spill of information. And in the event that information is spilled, it's reportable. So, and what do? There's potential fines. Now in New York State, we have something called the SHIELD Act. It really is new this year, March, but it's been talked about for the last few years. New York State has already had, through the Department of Financial Services, or DFS, it's already had requirements and regulations around cybersecurity for financial institutions. So covering insurance companies and anyone that operated a business under a financial license. But really, that's expanded now. All organizations in New York State, whether you're in New York State as a corporate headquarters or you're an out-of-state company, if you do business in New York State, you're required to do these 19 things. And based on the size of your organization, some of those individual best practices are exempt, but there are 19 things that you have to do. One of them is a risk assessment, and we'll talk about that in a second. Of course, when you have a breach, you're subject to lost downtime and lost revenue, lockups, loss of information, and now lawsuits. Business email compromises now equals lawsuits. We'll talk about that in a second.
So, hey, Holly, can I stop you right there?
Yeah,
we just need to launch one of the polling questions, and Maria's going to jump on and launch the question.
Okay, go ahead.
Holly, do you want me to launch the second poll on vulnerabilities now or wait?
We can do it in a second when I explain what a vulnerability assessment is.
Okay.
I want to ask about, has the organization ever done scanning or an assessment?
Okay. So the first poll is related to CP credit. So I'm going to launch that right now. And if everyone could complete that, we'll keep it up only for about 10 seconds so we can move the program along. And everyone is participating. So thank you so much for doing that. Okay, I am going to end the poll right now. Thanks, everyone. Holly, you can continue.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so what is the financial cost related to a breach? The average cost for a data breach, and this is updated data, is $6.5 million. For a medium company, meaning 500 to 1,000 employees, $2.6 million. I think that's pretty accurate. Part of what I do in Global Security IQ is incident response. And so when companies do get breached, we have the capability of responding, helping mitigate the breach, and then we do digital forensics that actually we are able to determine what exactly happened to help mitigate that breach. And so I think that 2.65 million is really an accurate information from what I've been seeing this year. And that's fines and lost downtime. And so unfortunately, some companies have had to pay ransoms. Ransoms are creeping up over the years. We used to see ransoms of 5,000 in Bitcoin jump to 30,000. Then last year they were around 120,000. Now we're seeing fines in the millions, or not fines, but extortion payments, ransom payments in the millions. So 43% of attacks are actually aimed at small businesses. That's a Verizon stat there. And so it's important to know that, because I think small businesses think, well, who wants what I have here? We're just 10 people. But it doesn't matter. If you have a vulnerability, you are vulnerable. And so 40%, 43%, that means small businesses are at risk, just like large businesses. And 60% of small businesses fail after 6 months. And that is directly attributable to the average cost of the data breach. Small businesses just don't have that kind of cash on hand, even to pay a ransom. In the US, last year in 2019, companies across the United States lost 3.5 billion due to cybercrime. And I think that's probably a low number, an unreported low number. Let's see here. So what is a vulnerability assessment? And we're going to ask 2 poll questions, because I think the practitioners in the space of cybersecurity, they confuse leadership. They confuse, I get people all the time, companies, they collect 2, 3 quotes, and then they ended up saying, well, help me match this up with this. And it's apples and oranges. And I think a lot of it's marketing language, and a lot of it is people that don't have the expertise in this field are hanging a shingle and saying, well, I'm going to do cybersecurity now. And they're really not equipped to do it. And they really don't understand. So a risk assessment, a vulnerability assessment is 2 things. So New York State Shield Act says that you have to do a risk assessment. Whether you're a big company or a small company, everyone has to do a risk assessment. New York State DFS actually says that everyone has to do a risk assessment. The Shield Act recommends a risk assessment. The Shield Act says that an organization has to take reasonable measures to protect data and to have a cybersecurity program in place, such as a risk assessment. It spells it out in the Shield Act. Vulnerability scan is for larger companies. It's mandated for larger companies. I'm here to tell you everyone should do a vulnerability scan. So a real vulnerability assessment is 2 things. It's a risk assessment plus a vulnerability scan. Now, there are 2 different things. A risk assessment, a good practitioner that knows what they're doing will use a framework. If you're in manufacturing, they'll probably use the 800-171 or the CMMC framework. If you are an other organization, you will probably use the NIST CSF or the cybersecurity framework. Let's talk about the NIST CSF. It's the most common one. It's flexible, really. It's usable for every business sector, no matter what your company mission is. There's over 120 controls in it. And so it's very complex. It's very technical. When you have a practitioner that does not really understand cybersecurity, I don't think they really understand the spirit of the controls. So what we do is when we measure the controls, on an assessment, it's not like an audit. So you guys are accountants, and so it's not an audit unless you're paying for an audit. Then you're actually collecting data and you're measuring perhaps 10% for each control on an audit. For an assessment, it's a little different. It's a little bit scaled back. You're asking 4 or 5 or 6 questions that really assess whether the organization is in fact executing on the spirit of the control. And if they're not, so the way we do it is, here are the controls. There's a column in our risk assessment report that says, here's what you do, and here's what you need to do. If the answer is no and you're not meeting the control, here's what you need to do to meet the control. If the answer is yes, the answer is yes, but sometimes it's a good to great. You're doing this, but you could be doing this, this, and that. And you're assigning a risk level. It is a risk assessment. And so literally the output really here is a PDF. We can do it in e-format as well. We've used Trello and Microsoft Teams to automate or to digitize, so we can have collaborative working on the recommendations. But generally, the risk assessment output is a PDF. And the mission of that document, again, is to assess risk. So a good risk assessment will tell you 5. That's a critical. That means you should address it, or you need to address it because you're subject to certain compliance. You have to address it, or you should address it. And so the numbers are 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, of course. And essentially, at the end of the risk assessment, the consumer of that document really is executive leadership. A skilled practitioner can put that in English to where they're translating sort of the technical jargon into plain business language where the C-suite can understand what really you need, so you can dedicate the appropriate resources in your budgets to acquire what you need to protect your company. A vulnerability scan is something completely different. It's part two of a vulnerability assessment. A scan is technical, it's very technical. You'll use a commercial instrument, a commercial tool to literally scan all the IP addresses and every single component on the inside of your network and the outside of your network, and you'll identify open ports, mispatches. It's a technical output. The consumer of that document is the IT, the head of IT, the IT practitioner. And then you have a conversation with them about which patches, they may need to do right now. So again, a skilled cybersecurity practitioner will ring the bell when they do a scan, and there's a vulnerability in the middle of the report that's 300 pages deep. And it's very, very important to Lumsden McCormick, for example. You must do this patch right now. So that's the kind of dialogue and the partnership that a skilled cybersecurity practitioner should develop with your IT people. So again, the risk assessment is for executive leadership and the IT people, but again, it's business language, and the vulnerability scan is technical. So I'll let you take away the poll questions, Maria.
Okay, we're going to do 2 polls consecutively. So I'm going to launch the second poll here on risk assessment. And I will share the results of this poll once we're done.
That'll be really interesting to know the answer. And how many people, Maria, are on the Zoom?
105.
Okay.
So Holly, I'll give you a few minutes to comment on the results, and then we'll launch the third poll question.
So
Holly, real quick, while Maria's working on the polling, one of the questions that have come in is, if you're evaluating a cybersecurity practitioner, is there a certification, a license, or something that the viewer should be looking for when they're looking to hire somebody locally to evaluate their system?
that is a great question. I'm glad. I may or may not have a slide that shows the logos, but the answer is absolutely yes. There are certifications that they should be seeking. The granddaddy is the CISSP, and a good cybersecurity practitioner should absolutely have that. And the beauty of that is the continuing ed. So you have to keep up with the threats, just no different than CPAs. You have to keep up with threats through continuing ed. And B, you have to have at least 5 years of actual hands-on cybersecurity experience and being mentored to even sit for the test. And then you have to have someone that has a CISSP endorse you that can attest to the fact that you, Jill, did in fact have this experience. So I think that's a very credible certification that is put out by ISC2. And again, it's the CISSP. The second one, that's the granddaddy, is ISACA, is an organization that has multiple certifications. And I think the one that's generally known in the accounting realm is the CISA, C-I-S-A. And I think people that have the CISA are really good at doing risk assessments because you're taught on how to assess. But the granddaddy for ISACA is the CISM, CISM. It's a Certified Information Security Manager. And the reason why that one is so important is you have to have 10 years of experience before you can sit for the CISM. So you have to have a little gray hair and some time on to do those two, the CISM and the CISSP. But really any of the ISACA ones are very credible. I think that's an organization that's been around for a long, long time. There's an institute called the SANS Institute that is really kind of, they're just classes you can take, They're very good educational classes, but they don't require you to have time in the field and to have the mentorship to really be able to do it. It's just like the CPA. I think you can take the test, but you still have to be an accountant for amount of time before you can be granted the CPA, correct?
That's what it was. There might be some minor changes in the requirements now, but yeah, forever it was you had to pass the test and you had to have 1 to 2 years of experience based on how much education you had.
Yes, yes, yes. And that's the other thing is this CISM, they require, they have different basically dimensions that you work on and different core functions, and you have to have expertise in each one of these core functions before you can sit for it. And you have to actually have someone from your job that you work with verify that you have the experience in these different core areas. So I feel like those are very, very credible, and they're not easy to get, and they're quite expensive. So I think you should definitely seek a practitioner that has certifications for sure. Because it's a problem in the IT realm. I see business IT companies right now saying, "Oh, cybersecurity is a new buzzword. We do cybersecurity," and they don't have the training and background. And we're an incident response firm, so I'm responding to these all the time. And I know that there are simple things that these organizations could have done to prevent this breach. And you can't prevent every breach. This is not a 100%, but you can significantly lower your risk by maybe 85%, 90% if you do the basics in the offensive hardening. So 78% have a current risk assessment. That's amazing to me. I've never seen a number that high. A current risk assessment. The add-on question to that would be was it internal or was it done by an external practitioner? That would be maybe something for next time, Maria. That is really, really good number. Of the 22% that don't have the risk assessment in place, I really highly encourage you to do one. And if you are among those that have one, you should be asking the question, did we do this internally or did we do it externally by a practitioner? Remember, internally, they'll be motivated to say yes when yes really isn't a yes. So you have to think about that outside checks and balances. No different than in your accounting world. This is why I love talking to accountants, because you get this, you guys get it. Second question, does your organization perform a vulnerability scan? Now remember, the scanning is technical, and it's a very important. We recommend a minimum of quarterly scanning for any organization. If you've had an incident, we do weekly scans for those. I'll give a second.
Holly, just to check on time, we are about 7 minutes out from the end of the session.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep, that's good. We can, I just have a couple basic slides on recognizing phishing emails. And I think we can go through that very quickly and get to other mitigation strategies on things you can do. But these two, the risk assessment and the vulnerability scan, are the number one and number two strategies for offensive hardening. Okay, so scanning. So you're somewhere close to 50-50. So roughly half, 54% have done a vulnerability scan. So I think you have to, again, look at how are you doing that internally versus externally. Do you have a good outside eye looking at the results? And if you're a no, that is something that you should absolutely be doing. That's money that you have to invest in your organization. Because a vulnerability scan can very quickly, relatively speaking, identify vulnerabilities that leave you potential to exploits. So very good. If you close that, we can move to the last couple slides, and I invite any questions. Thank you. All right. All right. So I mentioned before that most malicious code is still passed to organizations through email. And it's because of the social engineering. And I always talk about social engineering because you hear that in these realms. But again, in cybersecurity, nobody ever explains what these terms mean. Social engineering is nothing more than human manipulation. And it works because people are nice. You've heard countless stories of someone being able to sweet talk their way into past the front desk in an organization. And we're all raised to be nice, all of us in Western New York. People are very, very nice. And so, you know, there's that balance of security and not being rude versus being nice and protecting your organization. So there are certain principles that are used in social engineering that really translate to the emails. We've all gotten those where emails come in and they're speaking from a position of authority or potentially intimidation. You must do that. Or social proof. Jill did this for me yesterday. Or, you know, familiarity or liking. There are some of the principles that are really used. You have to know that these individuals, remember now, 50-50 basically. It's more like, you know, 60-40, but everybody, small businesses, large businesses are all vulnerable. And the reason why is the information we all put out there about ourselves on the web. It allows for information gathering. So think of a hacker in Russia or in China. They're gathering information based on your website, your employees, your vendors. LinkedIn is a gold mine of information. And that's how they select their targets and then promulgate an attack. So we're going to talk very quickly about ransomware and business email compromise. So 59% of organizations were hit by ransomware in the last year. I think that number's low. That's what's been reported. The average cost of a ransomware is basically $750,000 for a medium-sized company and 1.5 for a big company. Over half of the crimes, so the FBI has an internet crime complaint center. Over half of the complaints that come in go back to business email compromise. Business email compromise happens in two ways. Either an employee and an email is spoofed. All CEOs, CFOs, COOs have to think about that and worry about their email being spoofed, and then telling, you know, they're basically someone that works in the CFO's chain of command to go ahead and wire wire money to this new account. We've heard about those scams. Those scams now equal lawsuits. So phishing emails, we have to think about the trusted site. Remember to always look at, make sure you're going to the legitimate site. Always look at that code if you can see where it's trusted site. The email address, sometimes we're seeing email addresses where they're off by 1 or 2. A general salutation instead of your name being used. Some alarmist messages, you must do this, that sense of urgency. Always look for grammatical errors. Those are usually indicators that the source of that email is from a foreign source where English is a second language. Any kind of requesting to stop payment, change an account, or anything like that, you should be suspect of us. I explain what a business email compromise is. It is basically a sophisticated exam targeting businesses that perform electronic payments. Be very, very wary of electronic payments. You should have a control in place that if you do electronic payments in your organization, if there's ever any kind of change of somebody's account change, you should call your contact at the other end at the organization and verify the change. Training. You must train your employees. So that's our last poll question is, does your organization train employees on cyber threats? If you want to fire that poll up, Maria, I can talk about how to prevent.
Okay. As a reminder, we're coming close to the end. Participants, we may be a minute or two delayed in launching the next session. I will put that link in the chat. So just hang tight and we will move to the next session. Thanks, everyone.
I just have one more slide after this, Maria, and just, while the poll is happening. So training, 75% are doing training. That's interesting. 50-50 for scanning, but 25% of organizations aren't training. So I really recommend that everybody get training. The things that I just said to you are really very basic, yet they're not really commonplace for everyone. So you have to make sure that your organization does the training and you have good antivirus software, that you're using two-factor authentication for every single platform or account that will use it. We're all used to using it now for our banks. You should absolutely, at home and at work, do it everywhere. And of course, train your employees. If you want to advance that, Maria, I'll just go to my last slide, and then I can handle a question if there's time, or if not, if everybody needs a break, that's great. Okay, so what can you do as IT and management? I talked about multi-factor authentication, long and strong passwords. I have dialogue every day about long and strong passwords. The longer, the better. Longer is really what matters in a password. We at Global Security IQ recommend 14 plus. We're in line with the Center for Internet Security, CIS. The FBI recommends 14 plus. Make sure you patch. You have to do that vulnerability assessment. And remember, it's risk assessment plus a scan, and absolutely plan for a problem. You should have an incident response plan and a disaster recovery plan in place. Remember earlier, I talked about web applications being a threat. Make sure those are segmented away from the rest of your network. Make sure that highly critical devices are segmented and back up everything. So that's really all I have. And if you have any questions that we don't have time for, go ahead and email those questions to info, or email them to Jill or Maria, and I'm happy to take those questions.
Great. Thanks, Holly. We actually had our questions answered that came up through the Q&A. Certainly the best defense is a good offense, and you gave us some great tips and tools on what we should be focusing on, and getting those processes in place and getting those scans and risk assessments done. So we really appreciate having you meet with us this morning. And again, if you have any questions for Holly, please reach out. Her email is on the screen right now. You can reach out to myself or Maria. And if you look in the chat, you'll find the link to our next session. And we appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
And one last thing, everyone, don't forget to please complete the evaluation at the end of the session. Thanks very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.